Welcome all, Dr. JC here, week 5, part 2. Part 1, we talked about that Haitian Revolution. This part here, we're going to talk about what America or the United States considers its War of 1812. To the British, this was an American theater to a larger war with Napoleon, part of the Napoleonic Wars. So let's jump into this so-styled War of 1812, talk about the causes, and a little bit about the impact as well. Now, before we get into the actual causes and some of the more salient events and the impact, it's important to note here, and the reason I have the third point on this slide underlined, it's important to note here that this is the first time in American history, this War of 1812, this is the first time in American history that a sitting U.S. president has asked Congress for a formal declaration of war. James Madison, following the Constitution, he's known as the father of the Constitution, recognizes that Congress and Congress alone in the United States has the power to declare war or allow the President of the United States to declare war and thus turn the President into a commander-in-chief. So therefore, this War of 1812, it's the first time in American history a sitting U.S. president's going to ask Congress for a formal declaration of war, and Madison's going to get it. Understand it's going to be on party lines. We'll talk about this here in a minute, but he's going to get a war resolution. Before briefly talking about the causes, the War of 1812, at least in North America, the United States and Canada, is remembered as Mr. Madison's War. And it's remembered as Mr. Madison's War because the vote, as I mentioned a minute ago, was on party lines. No individual that was part of the Federalist Party at the time from New England, and the Federalists were largely associated with New England. It was a sectional party. None of them voted for the war. So this was entirely the party of Jefferson and Madison that had voted for this war. So again, it gives us some indication that, hi, when we get all this news today about party line votes in the United States, this is nothing new. Okay, it's not. So if you ever hear of this referenced as Mr. Madison's War, that's why. Among the several causes associated with the war, there are a few key ones. And it's important to recognize that the English had been at war with the French, Napoleonic France, for several years. And it's not just on land, it's at sea. And as a result of this, you figure a decade of wars, this grinds down in many ways the availability of service age men through loss through disease and normal combat, that sort of thing. And as a result of this, the British Navy in many ways was pulling sailors off ships and sticking muskets in their hand and sending them onto the continent to fight Napoleon. It left a shortfall of sailors at sea. Therefore, in order to make up for the shortfall of sailors at sea, the British just decided that, hey, we're going to go ahead and pick on our former colonies here in the Americas and test their mettle or strength. And so they began to fire on American vessels in international water. That's already considered an act of war. They stop American ships after firing on them. That's further an act of war. They board ships after stopping them and firing on them. And then they just go one step further and they begin to impress American sailors into British service. Basically, they capture them, put them on a British ship, and say, congratulations, you're in the British Navy now. At some point, American leadership has to respond to this. So the impressment of American sailors was one of the main causes of the war. A secondary major concern for Americans in the Madison administration was First Nations uprisings. Native peoples along the frontier, areas in the Louisiana Territory that was recently purchased from France. It was thought that the British were starting to arm these native peoples, stir them to rise up against Americans, and the combined weight of British interference in American westward expansion and outright violation of America's neutrality by firing on, stopping, boarding American ships, and then, quite frankly, capturing, shanghaiing, really, American sailors into British service. Something had to be done. And as a result of that, Mr. Madison asks Congress for a war resolution, and he'll get that, and the war's on. Well, clearly we can't talk about all the fights that take place here in the War of 1812, and what's depicted on this slide here are the northern campaigns. I do want to make mention of a couple different important battles. One shown on this slide here near the bottom, you see the explosion mark near Baltimore and near Washington. Well, in the wake of the British capturing Washington, and they will burn America's capital. Some of this is in retaliation for America burning buildings during their invasion into Canada itself, Toronto and elsewhere, all right? And eventually that building will be whitewashed, hence the White House comes about. But more importantly, in the wake of that, the British then focus on Baltimore. And if they can take Baltimore, then Philadelphia, then perhaps New York, and you can see where this is going. The problem is they are beaten at Baltimore. And as a result of that, we'll have a poem that's crafted by some individual, the dawn's early light, and a national anthem is born. So understand that the America's national anthem is born out of the War of 1812, not the American Revolution. Francis Scott Key's poem's immortalized. There's also a second important battle that I want to talk about here. It'll be fought in the Deep South, in New Orleans. And interestingly enough, it's going to be fought after the war is officially over. The war itself actually is going to technically end on Christmas Eve in Belgium. On December 24th, in Ghent, a treaty is signed between American emissaries and the British, formally ending the war in America. You say, well, why are the British ending this war? Well, because they've defeated Napoleon. And as a result of this, they figure, what the hell, we just need to get back to trade and rebuilding society. So things seem to be grinding to a standstill with our American cousins. We'd rather trade with them as far as it relates to goods and services rather than trading bullets. Helps our people better that way. So they hammer out this agreement in Belgium on Christmas Eve, and the war's over, right? Well, nobody can send a text message, and it's going to take a little while for news to cross the Atlantic. In the meantime, a fight is occurring in the Deep South, the Battle of New Orleans. While a very interesting battle in its own right, and I encourage everybody to Google it and read about it fairly quickly. You can do that. I'm going to focus on a couple key points. First and foremost, the obvious. It's fought after the war's over. So the loss of life here, an enormous loss of British life to be sure, was completely unnecessary. And in the modern age, if we had more instantaneous communication, that loss of life need not occur. That's point one. The second point, the American commander was an individual by the name of Andrew Jackson. And for those of you that may have heard the name or seen him on American currency, he's going to be an American president. And largely he's going to be elected because of his actions here at New Orleans. So Jackson in some ways becomes this sort of great what if. If the battle doesn't occur, does he get his name in the papers and able to use that then when he campaigns? I leave that up to you to decide. But the Battle of New Orleans was fought after the war was over, so it was really unfortunate for all parties, perhaps save Andrew Jackson here. When looking back and assessing the impact of the War of 1812, yeah, there's been a few different interpretations as it relates to the event. Most of those fall on national lines. The Americans, the sort of peacock version, haha, we whooped you British twice now, once in the Revolution and then in 1812. Yeah, there's some truth to that. But in the British telling, there's also some truth to it when they say, well, yeah, but you weren't really facing the full brunt and might of our empire at that time because we were fighting Napoleon, all right? It was kind of a sideshow for us. So don't get too all up in our face and all cocky, our American cousins, okay? Relax a little bit. Chill. So there's two competing sort of versions. Both of them have grounded in some reality. The larger reality, however, is that in the wake of 1812, Americans and British largely bury the bloody shirt, bury the sword, bury the hatchet, and start to come together as close allies. Individuals that recognize, two different nations that recognize we have vested interests in helping one another out to promote growth, to promote democracy, to promote this Western vision of what the world should look like. And from 1812 to present day, they've formed a very unique relationship. And one shudders to think what the world map might look like if the British and Americans hadn't come so close together. And when we get further along in the course and talk about World War I and World War II, I'm reasonably certain the French are going to be fairly thankful that the British and the Americans have become close allies. We'll see that down the pike. But for now, let's pivot out of part 2 here into part 3. And in part 3 next, we're going to talk about these revolutionary movements that take place in South America. So let's go to part 3 next. Dr. JC out, part 2, on to part 3.